Geraint Davies to move the motion.
Mr Stringer, it's a great pleasure to move this motion on fair trade during Fair Trade Fortnight. And what this debate is about is how to hardwire the ethics of fair trade into future trade deals as we break out of Europe. I'm standing here as a Labour and Cooperative MP, and I know the Co-op has got a very proud tradition of fair trade and solidarity, social justice, and of course in the Co-op retail side promote, fair trade, coffee and bananas and wine and chocolate, etc. Indeed, in Wales, I'm pleased to say that Swansea West, which I represent, Swansea is a fair trade city since 2004, and in fact, Wales was the first fair trade nation since 2008, and a lot of this work was done by the Forum for Fair Trade in Swansea. I'm also a supporter of the Fair Trade Foundation, who's tended to focus on cocoa producers in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana, and there are issues there around living incomes, of course, issues about gender inequality, and basically environmental standards as well. But coming to the crux of the matter, and we're all aware that we now face opportunities and risks, in fact, around striking trade deals. A lot of the focus has been about, naturally, the removal of subsidies and tariffs, and then moving on to talk about standards of products and services. But what I want to talk about today is standards in relation to the environment, labour, and crop diseases and the like, which can be used to undermine free and fair trade by providing unlevel playing fields. So fair trade, Mr Stringer, in a nutshell, is the principle that market actors should not gain a competitive advantage by adopting practices in other states that would be unlawful or unethical in their home states. In other words, the fair trade principle is really about we shouldn't outsource abuse, whether that's about human rights or environmental standards, but then import those products, creating unfair competition on domestic producers who've got to live up to higher environmental and ethical standards. So it's important that we don't have a situation where we have virtual slave labour to produce products that are below our standards, and we import those. And of course, this then naturally generates people complaining locally. There's uncompetitive rhetoric around stopping trade and how everything's unfair to domestic producers who miss out. Yes, I certainly will.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way and congratulating him on securing this debate in Fair Trade Fortnight. Does he agree with me that what Britain needs to do is to be a real example around the world by standards? And wouldn't it be a good idea if the government would set out clearly they intend to remain a signatory to the European Convention on Human Rights?
Yes, I think this is a massively important and crucial issue. There's been some ambiguity over whether we'll continue with the European Convention of Human Rights. Ministers have simply said, we're still in it when questioned. They haven't said they'll rule out leaving it, which leaves us with great concern. And if we're, as a country, deciding to basically define our own definitions of rights and human rights, other countries, whether it's China or Russia or others, will say, well, Britain are doing that. We were signatories 60 years ago. Winston Churchill was an architect of that convention, and it's very important for our standing that we continue with this. And indeed, moving on to other issues in relation to environmental and labour standards, there's an issue about our EU agreement now. There was a commitment for dynamic alignment to environmental and labour standards, and now that isn't any more the case. So it is the case that the EU, if those commitments aren't given, will think about imposing restrictions based on the presumption that that might be a doorway through you walk to provide uncompetitive and unfair advantage in trade by undermining rights, undermining the environment and undermining labour standards, and that's something certainly I wouldn't want to see. We know that in international agreements, they tend to be policed by independent tribunals that invoke investor-state dispute settlements. And those settlements very much focus on the interests of the inward investor, and that inward investor losing profit from the introduction of laws or restrictions by the host nation. And those laws and restrictions are often introduced to protect the host environment or workers' rights, etc. And then they invoke a fine on that country. So by way of example, the Minister will know that there's cases like Lone Pine fracking in Canada, who've suddenly sort of fined hundreds of millions of dollars to Canada because Quebec decided to have a moratorium on fracking. There's cases of companies fining Mexico on the grounds that they introduced a tax to protect people from diabetes on fizzy drinks. There's cases where these mechanisms are used against Slovakia when they tried to roll back privatisation. And the point I'm making here is that these particular arrangements have a chapter for the investor that completely overwhelms the balance of power in that arrangement in relation to human rights and the environment. So there may be an environmental chapter in some of these agreements, but they haven't got the enforceability that the investor-state tribunals do. And that's something I think that the government should be looking at in order to hardwire labour standards and environmental standards into trading agreements and to help sustain and grow fair trade. It's also the case, of course, that it would be ideal to have the Paris Agreement hardwired, as well as the Human Rights Convention, obviously, into new trade deals. But we already know that in the case of the US-UK negotiations, that explicitly the US want to rule out climate change in the Paris Agreement, which is of great concern. And so what I'm moving towards suggesting to the Minister, Mr Stringer, is that trade agreements really should be allowed for states to penalise social and environmental dumping as well as economic dumping. At the moment, under WTO rules, most trade agreements, that allows players to penalise other countries that overtly subsidise and dump products on their marketplace by way of tariffs, etc., or referral to a dispute resolution mechanism that I've already mentioned. But what it doesn't allow is that if we have social and environmental dumping, that we can do a similar mechanism. And I'm really wanting to use this opportunity to ask the government to look at these mechanisms so that countries aren't undermined by abusing people's human rights, abusing environmental conditions, and then undermining prices in the market, providing unfair competition. Obviously, in some of the trading agreements, there are references to some of these things, but essentially they're unenforceable. So we've got sort of warm words about we hope, we'll look after the workers and the environment, but they're not enforceable. And when push comes to shove, we see sort of disaster, in particular, in very poor countries. So therefore, if we're talking seriously about taking back control, leaving the EU, what I'm looking for is a trade policy that respects the environment, respects public health, respects social justice, and respects democracy. And on the democratic point, yeah, I certainly will, yeah.
Thank him for giving way and congratulate him on securing this really important debate. Does he share the Cooperative Party's concern that it's muted that the Department for International Development may well be wound up or merged, when actually what we need to see is it grow to really tackle inequalities around the world?
Yes, I think that's a point very well made. This is a critical point in time where Department for International Development needs to be closely engaged in the whole issue of negotiating trade deals. Having it as separate from the Department of Trade is helpful as well. But it doesn't. What we don't want is to have it absorbed or eliminated or pushed in the Foreign Office or whatever. But to be able to be a strong voice in a difficult time as we move forward, so that Britain can be seen to be championing these values, so that others can follow, rather than undermining standards and making people follow in the opposite direction. And coming back to the democratic point, it's important that we all are in this together, so to speak, by virtue of having democratic scrutiny, by virtue of having a vote on the mandate, by having as much transparency as is sensible in the process, and then having final scrutiny and a vote on the deal in Parliament. And this is something that's, of course, enjoyed by the US Congress. This isn't something that, this isn't much of an innovation, in fact, the idea of democracy in trade deals. US Congress looks at it, there's public consultation, and, of course, the European Parliament has a vote on trade deals. And, of course, we're taking back control, Mr. Stringer. We should have the similar or better rights ourselves. I mean, there is widespread concern. Yes, of course I would.
My honourable friend for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech, and I congratulate him on getting this debate. Does he agree with me that the current avenues for public and parliamentary scrutiny of future trade deals are really not fit for purpose, that the government must be transparent about their negotiating priorities to ensure that there's adequate social and environmental protections, and that they must provide scope for genuine parliamentary debate and influence in any and all trade deals?
Yes, I very...
It is normally good practice not to intervene on a speech when you've not heard the beginning of the speech. The honourable member gave way, so I allowed the honourable lady to speak, but it is not good practice to come in midway through a speech and intervene. Geraint Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer, and thank you very much for the intervention. And I very much agree with the points that was made, because what we don't want in a mature and open democracy like ours is to find a trade deal done in secret, then to wake up one day and to find there's all sorts of strange things in that agreement that we won't want. So by way of example, Mr. Stringer, we wouldn't want to wake up and find GM foods perhaps on our shelves, or chlorinated chicken, or hormone-impregnated beef that we know provokes premature puberty in children. We wouldn't want a situation where something had been negotiated on the grounds of regulatory cooperation, where on the chemical front we move from REACH, which is a process the Minister will know where if he were to produce a chemical, he would have to show that it was safe. But in the United States, if I were to produce a chemical, then the Office for Environmental Protection would have to show it's hazardous. And that's why, of course, asbestos is still for sale in the United States. So, we wouldn't want, well, I wouldn't want, and certainly I don't want a debate and scrutiny over whether regulatory cooperation led to the much higher incidence of hazardous chemicals or poor food. And I know there's been a commitment from the government that our standards of food production will be maintained, but the threat now is that whilst our farmers are delivering good food, the doorway will be left open for American farmers to pump in low-grade, low-price products that are consumed by poorer people who are under the hammer of austerity, and they end up, pumping GM-impregnated hormone-impregnated beef into their children and have strange medical side effects. That isn't the sort of thing I'd want to see, and certainly it's the sort of thing we want an open debate and discussion, and so the intervention is well made. We also don't want to see behind closed doors our NHS being undermined. I know there's been some suggestion, no, our NHS is safe in our hands and all this sort of stuff, but we already know that parts of the NHS is nationalised. The Americans clearly will want to compete in those areas. They also want access to patient data, and in fact a lot of the patient data has already been leaked to private companies. They also want medicine prices to go up by protecting patents more effectively, and that is in the World Health Organization obviously does promote higher medicine costs as well. And at a tragic time that we're talking about coronavirus and the issue of public health and the availability, equal availability of drugs to people for this and any future threats, these sort of protections are essential. And clearly we do need democracy to shine a light to actually then blow out the bugs in the system so we know what we're doing. And indeed, we do want to eliminate any clauses about ratcheting and standstill that basically are designed to stop the renationalisation of privatised utilities and industries. Clearly, people have different political views, but in a democracy, the balance of mix between public and private should be a matter of debate and discussion and public mood that is a moving target rather than fixed in one place or continuously going in one direction towards privatisation. I'll say a couple of words. I won't go on much longer because I know others want to speak about as we leave the EU, what we might want to change and retain. The Minister again will know that the EU offers countries tariff rate preferences, so through the EU general system of preferences and everything but arms schemes. And so there are preferential treatments given to certain developing countries, and there is an issue here that through bilateral trade agreements with other countries that we erode those standards relatively, or a concern that developing countries lose out as we carve up arrangements with developed countries. Yeah, of course I would, yeah.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way and for securing this debate. Do you agree with me, and I think you do from what you've been saying earlier about dumping and the issues for developing countries, that the new deals must not erode these hard-fought preferences given to countries in the Global South? And there is a real danger going forward that the new trade agreements brokered with other trading blocs will not be in the development interest of those countries. And we need further public and government scrutiny of these deals so that we can be assured that this won't be the case.
Yeah, very much so. Oh, sorry.
I recognise she's a new member. If you say you're referring to me, and I don't have a view on this thing. It's an easy mistake to make. Geraint Davis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stringer. Yeah, I would agree precisely. It is important that as we move forward that Britain shows leadership in this area, and as has been pointed out, DFID continues to exist to champion the needs of developing countries in terms of elimination of poverty, protection of our environment, sustainable development, and the context of the Paris Agreement as well, and that this isn't undermined by future trade agreements made in private. There's also the issue of the EU's economic partnership agreements for Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific. Now, there are slight issues with these because there are problems with these particular agreements that undermine regional integration and domestic production in these zones. And it seems to me it would be fair to have a balance of power between different groupings of nations rather than bigger powers making smaller powers less weak. So arguably there is an opportunity for Britain to continue to take leadership here, but unfortunately from without as opposed to within, whilst keeping forward these trading preferences. So I know a lot of people want to speak, Mr. Stringer, on this very important subject. So I simply say that this is a new chapter in Britain's history as we move forward as a great trading nation. And it's our responsibility to uphold the very best standards in human rights, workers' rights, fair play, social justice, the environment and democracy. And I very much hope that the Minister today can give those reassurances and that we can move from strength to strength on fair trade rather than using our EU exit as an opportunity to actually move in reverse.
Yes.
The question is that this House has considered trade deals and fair trade. John Howell.
It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship.